Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LoCoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LoCoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and we are back, and I am with Rick, our mental health consultant. And this week we have a two-part series, and this is something that we actually have talked about before, and just trauma in general. We wanted to obviously address trauma because it is so pervasive, of course, not just in society, but with what you do, your work with clients, but really actually like with what I do as well. So as a kind of broader topic, we're going to talk about trauma and treatments and those types of things. But the reason why we wanted to bring this up was something that actually I've worked with many clients over the years in this situation, and you've worked with people in this situation as well, where they maybe have had diagnosed eating disorders, and maybe technically they are free from their eating disorder. They, go to therapy, they go to maybe recovery, whatever they need to do. They're kind of good to go. They no longer have those tendencies, but now the eating disorder is resolved, but the reason why they had the eating disorder hasn't necessarily been resolved. So whether it was trauma or whether it was some type of control mechanism, whatever it was for the actual eating disorder, that is still there and it's still pervasive in their life, and now it just might be something different. So we really wanted to address kind of trauma at the root of the cause and look at that as kind of the deeper reason why. And we're not saying that it's not a good idea to fix your eating disorder, right? Like that's clearly a big goal, especially if somebody is really, really struggling, and as somebody who had an eating disorder and work through that, like it is incredibly important. It can be life-threatening if you don't address it. But if you don't address the deeper reasons why you have one or had one, it's going to come back and it might be worse and it just might be different. So you might not like to say you were anorexic, right? You might not no longer are going to not eat,
correct?
Right? But now you might have another thing, and it might actually be even worse.
Yeah, I think an easy way to kind of summarize this and look at it is cause and effect. If we look at an eating disorder as the effect, right? And so what I've been seeing is as we've started working together more and more, and I've been diving into kind of the physique bodybuilding, working with clients who are prone to this type of lifestyle, we've definitely seen, or I have seen, an increase in clients who have struggled with eating disorders. And so what I'm also finding is that people are coming to me and they're wanting help, they're wanting to get therapy, which is great. And what I'm hearing is they have already been in therapy, they addressed their eating disorder, but there's still some of these lingering manifestations that have occurred throughout their life. They're struggling with anxiety, they're struggling with stress, aggression, instability, emotional instability, etc. And so on one hand, I respect it, because I think what sometimes the eating disorder clinic is saying, or what some of these therapists are saying, and for the record, I do not specialize in eating disorders. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I want to go see Rick about an eating disorder, I will refer you out. What I appreciate about it is the eating disorders are they're like, we're going to treat your eating disorder. We might not touch anything else. We're not going to go through your history. We're not going to get an understanding of your childhood or your late stage development in life, any of that kind of stuff. Your family histories, we don't care. We're going to teach you how to manage this. So on one hand, I respect that approach, because they're saying, look, this is our scope and we're staying within our scope. And to a large degree, they're helping people. But it's kind of like what we're talking about here. That's the effect. The effect became the eating disorder. What was the cause? What created these symptoms that led us to finding an eating disorder as a way to cope or a way to self-soothe? And so I think that's where the idea of trauma usually starts to play a role, is that when I start diving through somebody's history, and even though they're like, oh, I'm past my eating disorder, I've learned how to manage that, but there's still other things that are happening in their life, and it's like, okay, now it's time for us to dig a little bit deeper, to go through your childhood, your adolescence, your early adulthood, because there's a lot of things that happen throughout that time frame that can reinforce this. And you may not have an eating disorder, but if you're struggling with sleeping, if you're having nightmares, if you're having difficulty in your relationships, if you can't sustain relationships, or you're struggling with your job, there's a lot of different ways that it can manifest. Alcoholism, addiction, gambling addiction, you know what I mean? All the different ways that you've seen.
And sometimes it's not even, so say somebody, for example, was bulimic, right? So they're binging, they're purging, they're going through all these really intense things. And so maybe that is fixed, right? Like you're no longer doing that. But the client typically is still going to have, like you said, these unresolved issues, and that still might manifest into hyper control of what they're eating, not be very impulsive with their actions around food, really becoming obsessed. Like there's so many great things about tracking apps and devices and wearables and all these things, and like it can be really, really great, but it also does have a dark side for people who are kind of just more prone to that, or maybe have already had issues in the past. So like, if somebody's like, I have to hit exactly this many steps per day, or they have a total and then they have to go above that, or they need to be a certain number on the scale, like whatever it might be, like they still have these like control issues in these outlets. And so it might not technically be like, well, I'm not bulimic anymore. You're like, yay, that's awesome.
Right.
But you still are doing these behaviors, which then of course is going to affect everything else in their life. It's not just like if you are obsessed with meticulously hitting your food 24/7, it doesn't just affect your food or your relationship with food, it affects everybody around you.
Correct.
So that's where the issues...
And that's where we begin to see, when we talk about those other aspects of how to determine when something has become problematic in your life. Forget the diagnosis, it doesn't really matter. Is this causing clinically significant harm in your life? And so you might be saying, all right, well, clearly being bulimic, being anorexic causes physical harm and emotional harm, and it can affect other people. I'm no longer those things. But if you're controlling your meals, if you're controlling other people's meals, if you can't relax, it's affecting your family, it's affecting your work, it's affecting other relationships in your life, your social life. It could be affecting your finances to a degree. If you're now only eating like organic, free range, everything, your grocery bill goes from like $100 a week to like $300 a week. There's, and I'm always trying to guide clients away from extremes. Extremes are never a good thing. When you're
they're so easy, but they're not
so much one way, it's so easy to fall into those traps. And it's like moderation is the key, and it's learning to balance these things. And that usually is the most difficult part. Sometimes we have, some really high functioning clients where that task is a little easier for them, and they can conceptualize it. They possess enough insight and they're resilient enough to make those changes and bounce back. But when you have like the clients who literally have to give like their diet watch or their tracking watch to their husbands or wives to hide or destroy or not know where it is, it's like we've got a little bit more serious issue to work through here.
Yeah, and I've had clients who've done that. Like it is a serious thing, and I'm glad that they're self-aware enough to do that. But it's also like, okay, hey, we really need to address this. This isn't just like, just put it in the drawer. Like that might work for this week, but we really need to address like those deeper issues of like, why are you so obsessed with it? And that's actually a whole different thing. It's like behavioral addictions, but we want to focus on trauma. So let's dive into it.
All right. So,
my classic segue.
Yeah, great segue. So what is trauma and how has it changed over the years? I think there's a lot of different ways for people to conceptualize trauma. And one of the things I always tell my clients is one person's ceiling is another person's floor. So what can sometimes be traumatic to you literally means nothing to the other person, and vice versa. So it's not about judging the experience. A lot of times you'll hear kind of vague descriptions of it, like it's going to be life-threatening or perceived as, something that could be life-threatening to somebody else, could cause serious bodily harm or like an intense fear reaction as a result of it. So we could be talking about being assaulted, we could be talking about being burglarized, we could be talking about a car accident. But trauma can also be losing someone. You can be a child and you lose a parent or a grandparent. So anything that kind of threatens your stability or your sense of survival can really be a traumatic experience. And you can talk to 10 different clinicians and probably get 10 different definitions of what trauma is. But looking at it in those vague terms and not necessarily trying to pinpoint it to one particular event. I think a lot of times people will look at something and like when you look at the definitions of PTSD, even in the current DSM, it's not very clear. There's a lot of information about trauma, but there's still so much that's unknown. So when I hear people who are like experts in trauma, I'm always a little reserved, even to call myself an expert in trauma, because I don't think that I am. And I think it's so complicated and so complex that it can take time to really sift through things. And it's also layered. So once you start discovering some things, it can open the door. You can really open Pandora's box with some of this stuff. and you start diving through it. So one of the things that I want to talk about is complex trauma and what is complex trauma, because it's been called things in the past like neurological developmental issues, or developmental trauma is a big thing that they'll use. Like if you follow the trauma-informed care model, they kind of follow those things. But complex trauma is something that is rapidly building momentum behind it within our field. And really what it is, it's a way of kind of dissecting a person's life and looking at their history as a whole and understanding where these issues have taken place and how they've affected you. And there's a difference between adult trauma and child trauma. And we'll get into what some of those differences are, but basically complex trauma, to read from some definitions that I have, is it generally refers to a traumatic experience that is interpersonal and is premeditated, planned, or caused by other human beings, such as violating or exploiting another person. So that's like a lot of information. And it can cover so many different things. What does that look like? So you can start breaking it down in terms of categories. We have physical trauma, sexual trauma, psychological trauma, emotional, neglect. Like it just starts to breed into a lot of these different categories. And so I think sometimes we can hear other people's stories, when somebody's like doing a podcast on trauma, or they're doing a TED Talk on trauma, or there's something and they're like, well, that didn't happen to me, right? And we tend to take their examples of what trauma is, and it's like we compare it to our life, and if that didn't happen, well, I must not have trauma. So it goes missed, it goes undiagnosed, and people kind of suffer in silence throughout the rest of their life, struggling with these things. And so one of the things that I really want to break down from a complex trauma perspective is there's essentially two, there's three, but there's two types of trauma. There's interpersonal trauma, which relates to people within your life, close proximity to you, mothers, parents, brothers, sisters, coaches, people who are like really within that intimate circle. And it relates to their personal actions taken against you. And then there's impersonal trauma, right? So what is an example of impersonal trauma? Impersonal trauma are kind of like acts of God, natural disasters that are traumatic in their experience. So we live in Florida. We're used to hurricanes, right? We get used to it, but every once in a while, one rips through and it destroys an entire city. That's traumatic. But there's a difference between that type of trauma and interpersonal trauma. And the major difference is there's a deliberate intent versus an accidental intent. And it's that deliberate nature that really messes with somebody's mind. Because we can conceptualize a hurricane. It's out of our control, it's an act of God, it's indiscriminatory, like it affects everyone, and it's just, we're a victim of circumstance at that point. Versus, your mom being an alcoholic and never being around, or your dad being physically abusive, and it's like, this is the person who's like literally building in my brain as I'm developing my sense of safety and security, my ideas of love and belonging and my self-esteem and who I am as a person. That's all being shaped around abuse now. So if you think about like a child's life as like a jigsaw puzzle, every experience fits neatly into the next one. Well, what happens is when a traumatic experience occurs, it's like somebody throwing like a pile of mud in the middle of that puzzle, and it doesn't fit to anything, and everything else has a difficult time attaching to it. And so that's where we begin to see some of these issues start to develop. And this is ultimately what leads us to like eating disorders, problems with anxiety, issues like that.
Because those are typically going to be more frequent too, right? I would imagine, because obviously like a traumatic event is likely not happening, like you said, whether it's the hurricane or the car crash, or, you do get, like robbed, whatever. Like those are all awful things, but those might happen like once. Versus the interpersonal stuff, like first of all, like you feel close to these people, or you should feel close to them, and then it's kind of like a betrayal, like, why did this happen? Like I thought I was, then that's like very confusing, especially I could imagine like as a child. And then those are likely to be more repeated. So I feel like that's probably why it goes undiagnosed or like just, hey, this didn't happen to me, or like it's not really a big issue. Like if somebody like robs you or somebody like rapes you, you're like, okay, wow, this was a very big traumatic event. But if there's like these like small things happening in the background, but they've been happening for 10 years, those build, and then that's likely to not be addressed.
Exactly, like a perfect segue into the next part. So violence can be one thing at a time, right? So you're talking about an assault, you're talking about a rape. That's a specific incident, that's a one-time occurrence. But usually what happens with childhood trauma is that it's chronic and it's repeated over a period of time. And basically what we find is that as a result of these types of relationships, they develop, the individual develops like difficulty with secure attachment issues. They develop insecurities. They have difficulty trusting people. There's an uneasiness that lives within them. And the problem with that is the individual gets exploited, usually because of that particular parent's own history of unresolved trauma. So when people are always talking about repeated cycles of trauma, what's happening is the parents or the people who are within this person's real intimate circle have their own unresolved issues, right? And so if you follow like Carl Jung, he talks about shadow material. So shadow material are things that are driving from our subconscious mind. And we deal with these materials, which can be really deviant and dangerous and hurtful to people in one of like 4 basic ways. Well, one of the most dangerous ways is projecting. And so we project our insecurities onto people. We repeat cycles and patterns because those are the types of love that we received. And when you're a child and your brain is developing, if this is what is being sent, like you have to think of something as totally vacant. And if you don't give it love and support, what else are you giving instead of that? You're giving instability, you're giving a sense of fear, you're giving anxiety, you're giving stress. And that becomes so chronic and repeated that people have a difficult time reestablishing a sense of safety. And so that's where we begin to see the development in the brain starting to change. And so it occurs, on a lot of levels. And so I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that research finds that obviously when a person is subject to childhood abuse, they're more likely to be re-victimized later in life, hence repeating the patterns. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times they'll find themselves in these situations because they're familiar to them. And it's what feels comfortable to them, despite it being something that, like, if you were to read about it, you'd be like, this is clearly not healthy, not okay type of behavior, but they find themselves in these situations. And sometimes it's almost an attempt to relive the experience to correct it. And they feel like once I'm in a new abusive relationship, but I can correct my husband or my wife. It doesn't have to be physically abusive. It can be emotionally abusive. It can be neglectful. You can, my father was an alcoholic and suddenly I'm married to an alcoholic. Is that an accident? Are you subconsciously seeking these things out because these are internal drives and this is what's familiar to us? And so it's really complicated and it's difficult because what we oftentimes will see in adults is they do not present with classical signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. So when you look at PTSD and you're looking for things like arousal symptoms and intrusive thoughts and avoidance features, they're there, but they don't have like, I'm not having flashbacks, I'm not having nightmares, I'm not having some of these other symptoms. And so while they may not even bring it up in sessions, you have to kind of dig to find some of these things and uncover it. And it's like, now we're seeing the root cause of your stress. We're seeing the root cause of your anxiety.
And that's what we both do in just in different ways. And that's really what is so important, in my opinion, with coaching, with therapy, and finding the right people for this. Because if you just had people like, hey, come in and tell me what you want to talk about, right? Or like whatever, like they might say something that like they think is really like upsetting or awful, but you're like, that's not really like the actual reason, right? Mm-hmm. Or like, and that's the same thing like with our clients. Like I can look at somebody's behavior and see what they're doing, like with their food, with their training, with their mindset, whatever it might be. And I've learned to ask the right questions and like kind of read between the lines enough to be like, okay, that's not why you're doing this. Like, that's not why you're actually upset. Like, we need to figure out like what's behind this. And there's always a reason. It's just kind of like, some people are very open. Some people will tell you right away. Right. Some people don't even know actually what it is. They're like, I just feel this way and I don't know what to do about it. That's why thankfully we have you on the team now. But there's a lot of like you said, it can be so varied. And because it's not as, I don't want to say it's not as traumatic because that's not the right way of putting it, but it's not as like forcefully traumatic so that people just kind of like write it off. And it's like this low grade anxiety or, whatever it might be that kind of just plays out in their life. And then that's why they always fall into the same behaviors. Yes. That's why they always like, oh, every time I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to diet. Every time I'm uncomfortable, I'm going to go drink. Every time and it always just happens in these same behaviors. And it's like really sad. And it makes me like, it hurts when people you can see what they're doing and like they can't see it. If you've worked with somebody for long enough, like I can literally see what people are doing and like the cycles that they're like trying to go through. And I'm like, no, like we can't do that again. Like, let's not do that. But it's hard because it is comfortable. Like, it's so much more comfortable to go back to what we know, even if it is wrong.
Even if it's unhealthy.
Yeah, even if you know it's wrong too. Like, you're like, I know this is not a good idea. I know this is bad on all fronts.
People know cigarettes are dangerous for them.
Oh my God.
And they still smoke.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's insane. But to help illustrate a sense of where the instability comes from. And when I say instability, that can be used interchangeably with like feelings of depression and anxiety, a sense of insecurity within yourself. So instability is a very broad term in that sense. But when we're looking at complex trauma, because it can be repeated and because it can be chronic, and furthermore, if it's happening within your household and it's left unaddressed, right? So a violation occurs. Normally, like in our minds when things are supposed to make sense, is somebody wronged us, it was acknowledged, and action was taken, and resolution was made. But what happens is that doesn't occur when it's within our own family, especially when they're unaware that they might even be traumatizing us. So not only is it repeated, but it becomes chronic over time. So what it does is it's like a person experiences a traumatic event, and think of it like a chart where it spikes up. And so now everything is heightened around them. And they're anxious as hell, and that survival mode has kicked in. Well, generally speaking, most people have an opportunity for that peak to begin to decline and return back to normal. But when we live in a traumatic or chaotic environment, and it continues to happen because it's chronic and it happens over time, it continuously spikes. And we're never given enough time to reach that equilibrium again. And the awareness of that, the insight that you possess that tells you instinctively, your subconscious is screaming at you saying, like, we know this can happen again at any time, so it never allows you to reach a relaxed state. You're always in a state of hypervigilance. You're in a state of constant stress, of anxiety, because you don't know when the next bad thing is going to happen. And so, like, the analogy that I use that we were talking about a little bit before is kind of like, picture yourself on a treadmill and you're walking, but somebody else has control over the speed button. And so I'm gonna jack it up to 20 and you're gonna sprint, and that's like a traumatic experience, right? And it's at 10 and you're sprinting just to keep up. You no longer care about what else is happening. You're just trying to survive this moment. And all of a sudden that starts to decline. Right? But you don't know when it's going to kick back up again. And so now you're exhausted, but I'm going to jack it back up to 20. And now you have to run to keep pace. And you never get a chance to rest. You never get a chance to recuperate. You never get to step off that treadmill. So what we see is people abandoning situations earlier than they should. We see people developing avoidance symptoms to deal with this. This is where substance abuse, addiction problems, they have their origins in this stuff. This is also where we begin to see issues with, if you can't control the treadmill, what can you control? Your eating, your diet, your habits in life, especially when we become a little bit older and we have more control over our environment, right? Because when you're a child, you don't have any control. You're a victim to whatever your parents want to do or whatever is happening in that household. And so as a parent, you definitely need to be taking safeguards to make sure that your environment is safe and loving and supportive and nurturing. Because if it's not, we're creating these conditions within people. And so essentially what's happening is, rather than a kid developing, and putting effort into learning and growing and developing as a person, they're spending their time and energy into coping and surviving. And so that doesn't leave them room to develop these other things. They're just constantly surviving because they don't know when I'm going to push that button and jack that treadmill back up to 20 and they're going to feel like they're going to die. And so they just kind of bounce back and forth between this space of really bad things are going to happen and I don't know when. And that is terrifying.
And that's really where I think that is why I see a lot of people with the food issues or the exercise issues or both together, because it really is an easy thing to control, especially when you don't feel like you have control over the rest of your life. You know exactly what you're eating, you know exactly how you're training, you can really dial those things in. And most people, at least that I've worked with, who have these issues are typically people who have control issues. They're typically people who have just very like OCD tendencies. And I don't know if that's because they're just like, naturally inclined to those, or if it's because like that's developed from it, or both, whatever it might be. But like those are really easy things that like, and they're not as harmful, like in society. People don't really deem that as harmful, right? Like if you're going out and getting blackout drunk every night, like people might be like, hey, you might not want to do that anymore. Like this isn't good for you. Now like you can't go to work, or like you're missing things or events, whatever. You're getting behind on bills. If you're controlling your food, nobody's really like, oh my God, like you might get comments here and there, of course, but it's not as like, it's not a like norm in society that's like, oh, don't do that, right? So I think that's also too where it can get like a little bit slip through the cracks, at least, because it's, if you have avoidance behavior and now you're using heroin, okay, that's typically like looked at as not a good thing.
Right.
But if you're like obsessively tracking your macros, or, like can't put down your Fitbit, like everybody's like, okay, you're a little off, but like doesn't really matter, right? Like nobody's really like looking at that.
It seems less harmful.
Yeah, it seems like, oh, this is less harmful, but it actually might be leading into other things that could be more harmful, which is the issue.
And, I have somebody who's in my life I'm very close with who is a licensed psychotherapist, and she's been doing it for 30 years. And, when I'm struggling with clients, I'll bounce things off of her. And she opened my eyes to this, and this is exactly what you're talking about. So when we get into there's a lot of different categories as to how trauma can affect people. And I'm really glad you brought this up, because one of the main ways that it'll occur is we'll talk about alterations in regulation of affective impulses. And so what does that mean? And so one of the aspects of it is people within this category tend to lean toward self-destructive behavior. And traditionally, when we think of self-destructive behavior, we're thinking about it in when people say self-harming behavior. And I remember I was talking about this, I was processing a client with this person, and we were talking about their particular need, and they were in abusive relationships after abusive relationship, literally people beating the crap out of her. And we were talking about diagnosis, and we were going through symptoms, and I'm like, she doesn't present with any self-harming features. And she's like, what? She's like, wait a minute, back up. And I'm like, she doesn't cut herself. She hasn't made any suicidal gestures or attempts. And she's like, you don't think being in an abusive relationship repeatedly and this pattern that has existed is a form of physical harm? And I was like, and I had to stop, and I was like, shit, she's right. It is. And so it opened my eyes to that. And that's exactly the category that eating disorders fall into. We develop them because it's a sense of control. It's a self-soothing mechanism. It is a coping mechanism for dealing with stress and anxiety. So in some ways it's used that way, but it is also, given the destructive nature and the ways that it can harm you, it definitely falls into that self-harming category. And so it's not something that we can ignore. It's easy to dismiss it, right? Because it seems so subtle. And when you look at somebody who's hiding a Fitbit or cutting their arm, let's go with hiding the Fitbit. That seems, and it is, right? It has certainly less potential for lethal consequences, but the result is still you're
mentally that the result might be the same.
Yeah, exactly. You're struggling with whatever that issue is, and while it may seem not as dangerous as attempting suicide, it certainly is self-destructive and can lead to dangerous things.
That was really highlighted well in this book, and I told you about it that I was reading. So it's called Irresistible. It's all about behavioral addictions, and typically people always think of addictions as alcohol, drugs, gambling, porn, whatever it might be. These are very physical, tangible things. They can typically be looked down upon in society. But with the surge of technology, surge of screens, surge of social media, our brains really haven't processed how to handle those well quite yet. The influx has been so rapid compared to anything else really that we've dealt with up until this point in time. And just because it's doesn't have the same effects, you might not be getting blackout drunk or doing meth, but you have this behavioral addiction to your phone, and that is causing all of these other issues in your life, which actually could cause suicide, it could cause eating disorders, it could cause physical harm. Or people are literally addicted to video games, and you're like, oh my gosh, really? Get over yourself. But the way that they're designed and the way that people fall into them, they're these same addictions. It's just now it's a video game, and you're now not leaving the couch for 3 weeks, and you haven't slept, and all you do is eat junk food, and now you literally have no interpersonal coping skills.
Right.
So it's different, but it's similar. So it's just it's part of what the book was talking about is going over these behavioral addictions, how yes, they do physically present differently than what we typically think of for addictions, but it doesn't mean that they're really any less harmful. And we're just now seeing the effects. We're just now seeing, what is the huge rise in anxiety and depression in teens? And it's not a surprise that that's happening based on the way that all of these things have like unfolded with the technology and the screens and all of this stuff. But it's like, you can't ignore this. Like, and it's only been like 10 years. So it's like, holy shit, this is terrifying. You know what I mean? Like, this is so new, and we're really just now seeing like what's happening. It's honestly very scary. Like, the book was really good. I would highly recommend it. But yeah, I think it's just different, and it just presents differently. So people think this isn't as serious, but it's like,
yeah. I tease that I'm going to start a side business where I call it the art of conversation. And part of the thing is going to be, you're going to send your teenagers, you're also going to send your parents and adults. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have like an old school locker system in the beginning, in the entryway, and everybody has to put their phones in the locker. And you can do this, like, for those of you who are parents at home, like, take your kid's phone away from them for 15, 20 minutes and watch them. You'll see them like reach for their pockets, and you'll see the anxiety start to build. And then you look at the phone after 20 minutes and it's filled with notifications from Instagram, from Snapchat, from whatever news outlets or filters that they follow, or whatever Twitter accounts that they have. And it's all crap. It's the same stuff. Whatever you're looking at today, you're going to be looking at 2 years from now. You're literally missing nothing. But people are becoming more and more dependent and reliant on those things. And I think we could do a whole nother podcast on that alone.
We totally have to.
So
I'm so fascinated by this. It's the strangest thing. Like, just all of that is so interesting to me.
It is. And adults fall into the same thing. I mean, there's routines and patterns that I have when I come home. It's kind of like, I have to throw my phone into a drawer. I have to disconnect from it, because otherwise I'll find reasons to seek out my phone. Yeah. You know, to text somebody something for this, or to check out an appointment, and once you do that, you're going to scroll through CNN. Exactly. You're going to go through whatever it is. And so you know, what should have taken 2 seconds takes 20 minutes.
For sure.
And so you go down that rabbit hole. But I guess the last part that, I really want to talk about before we kind of transition into the next podcast, which will be on, more treatment and some of the other impacts and reactions that trauma can have, is one of the ways that's kind of helpful to understand it is, think of your mind as having 2 separate minds. We have like an emotional mind, and we have a reasoning or a thinking mind. And what happens is, when we experience trauma, our thinking mind, especially as a child, shuts down. And we fall into survival mode, which is all an emotional mind. And this is essentially where fight, flight, and freeze are stored. And what happens is, when trauma is chronic, when trauma is repeated, when a traumatic experience occurs and no one is there to help you process it and make sense of it, it leaves us with a constant feeling of unease and being unsafe. And it's that fear that, because these events can happen again, it alters kind of the next step, which is our alarm system in our brains. And this is where we begin to see the brain really rewired in a wrong way. Whereas a person who is hypervigilant, a person who is constantly stressed and living in a state of fear, they begin to interpret every situation as potentially dangerous, right? So you have dangerous situations, which are inherently dangerous, and you should have a fear response for that. But then we see things that are more neutral, but they're still having a fear response to it. And then we see things that are totally safe, and they're having a fear response to it. And this is where it creates issues in their relationships, their sense of safety, their thought processes. It can make them feel emotionally unsafe, intellectually unsafe. They feel unsafe in what they're thinking and what they're feeling and physically within their body. And so this is a really difficult thing for people to understand. And when trauma happens as an adult, you possess a greater ability to use that reasoning mind or that thinking mind to help you make sense of it and to shift through it. And when something traumatic occurs, this is the role that a therapist often assumes. We discover kind of what the issue is, but you're an adult, you're a little bit more developed, especially if you've had a decent childhood where these traumas didn't occur. You can reason with it, place it in its space, and shape it to where now other pieces of your life can build from it, and you learn from it, and you grow. You found meaning and purpose in it, and it no longer controls you. You've moved from the victim mentality to survival, and that's that. But it doesn't occur that way when you're a child. That part of the brain can severely become damaged, and it needs to be reworked. We'll get into how you do, what treatments you should be utilizing or looking for and seeking out, and in the next podcast.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect place to stop for now. And then, so last time, just if you guys listened, so we had this really great one, and like normally we just like to talk, and it's just like better to put into two, but because it's hard to edit things, like literally it just like stopped. So we were like, all right, we probably shouldn't do that again. So we're going to stop this now. We're going to split it up. So next part will be out on Wednesday. So thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you next time.